Alright, so I have been asked if I would make a video explaining how to use the quadratic formula or giving a couple of examples, and so that is what I'm going to do. First off, the quadratic formula, which is on the formula sheet for the EOCT, is right here. Okay, remember that this negative means the opposite of, so if b is originally positive, it would become negative here, but if it was originally negative, it would become positive there. Also, another thing to remember is that it's all over 2a. Okay, in other words, everything on top you want to simplify before you divide by 2a. It's not just this part or just this part that's over the 2a. Okay, so I'm going to do an example. One of the things to know about the quadratic formula is that it is one of two ways to solve a quadratic that always work. The other way that always works is completing the square. Factoring does not always work. Taking the square root does not always work until you complete the square. Let's see, what else is there? Graphing also does not always work. So quadratic formula and completing the square are two things that you could always do. So first thing I have to do is identify my A, my B, and my C. This is A, this is B, this is C. Remember that A, B, and C are coefficients. They're numbers. So for instance, you would not say that B is negative 4x. It's just negative 4. If it's not in the standard format here with the x squared term first and then the x term and then the number, and it's all together on one side of the equation, this is kind of like it says equals 0 or y equals, you could think of it either way, then you have to get it there before you can identify your A, B, and C. All right, so this one's ready to go. I know what A is, I know what B is, I know what C is. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to plug in. I would strongly advise you when using the quadratic formula, when you first plug it in, just plug it in. Don't try to do anything while you're doing it. Like don't try to square B or change the sign of B or multiply A times 2. Just plain old plug it in. So I have opposite of, and B is negative 4, plus or minus square root of, negative 4 is squared, minus 4 times A times C is negative 1. And that's all over 2 times 3. So all I've done here is I put B here, A, C, A.
Tina Fennell, please come to the main office for a delivery. Tina Fennell.
Excuse the interruption. And now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start simplifying. So the opposite of negative 4 is positive 4, plus or minus square root of negative 4 squared is 16. And then because this is minus and this is negative, those are going to cancel each other out and make this whole thing plus. It's going to be plus 12. So I've got 16 plus 12. And on the bottom, 2 times 3 is 6. So that can further simplify to 16 plus 12 is 28. And now I have to think about the biggest perfect square that goes into 28. That would be 4. So 28 is square root of 4 times square root of 7. And this comes out as a 2. So this will be 4 plus or minus 2 root 7 all over 6. Now this is one of the rare occasions where you can actually simplify this. Remember, you could only simplify a fraction that has a plus or a minus on top or on bottom if you could divide the same number out of all three terms, like everything. And that's true here. I can take a 2 out of 4. 4 divided by 2 is 2. 2 divided by 2 is 1. And 6 divided by 2 is 3. I don't mess with the square root of 7 because remember, it's children outside the house can play with other children outside the house. You don't worry about, you don't interact numbers that are outside of a radical with numbers that are inside a radical. So we have 2 plus or minus 1 times the square root of 7 over 3. Another way that could be written, especially on a multiple choice test, you never know how you're going to see it, is 2 over 3 plus or minus square root of 7 over 3. Those two things mean the same exact thing. So this is your answer or this is your answer, whichever way it's given in the answer choices. Okay, next example. Wanted to also come up with an example that has a negative under the radical, and so I think this one's going to fit the bill. If I had f of x or y equals x squared plus 6x plus 12. And again, this is already in the right form. My x squareds are all together, x is all together, numbers all together. This is a equals 1, b equals 6, and c equals 12. So x equals, and I'm using the formula, just plugging it in, opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c, all over 2 times a. You might notice the difference here between what I did over here when I just plugged it in and what I'm doing here. Is here I put parentheses only because it was a -4 and I wanted to make sure I understood and realized that the negative went with the 4. So in other words, I was plugging in a -4, so I put parentheses around it. Because there's a difference between -4 squared and a negative out in front of 4 squared. So if I wrote it like this, it would mean something different. So I knew that I wanted to square all of b squared, so I put it in parentheses. I didn't have to do this here because b wasn't negative, so I didn't really have that need. All right, so moving on. -6 plus or minus 6 squared is 36. 4 times 12 is 48, and because there's only one minus, it's going to stay minus. So 36 minus 48. As soon as you see this, this is what tells me I'm going to have an I in my answer, because I take a number and I'm subtracting a number bigger than that. That means I'm going to get a negative, so my answer is going to have an I because a negative is under the radical. So this gives me -6 plus or minus 36 minus 48 is -12, all over 2. Now, the negative underneath the radical here is going to come out as I. Okay, so you could go ahead and split this up, rewrite it now and just say that's like I times square root of 12. And now I need to think about how do I simplify square root of 12. Well, square root of 12 is square root of 4 times square root of 3. Square root of 4 is 2. So this is -6 plus or minus 2 times I times square root of 3, all over 3. We always put the number in front of the letter here. The only exception to that is a radical. We put radicals in the back so that we don't get confused about what's up under the radical and what's not. Now this is a case where it would be really, really tempting to simplify it. Because when you look at this, 2 goes into 6 and 3 goes into 6. So most people would probably look at that and go, oh, I can simplify. But the answer is not, but the reality is no, you can't simplify. Because there's no number here that goes into 2, into 3, and into 6. It has to go into all 3 of these terms before I can simplify. So that is actually my final answer. The only way it could be written differently, and in this case, after we wrote it differently, then we could simplify, is remember how we broke that fraction apart in the last one? We could do that here. We could put this part over 3 and this part over 3 separately. So that gives me -6 over 3 plus or minus 2i root 3 over 3. Now this actually can be simplified because 6 over 3 is 2. So I could do this. This is the same thing as this. Those are the same answer, just written in 2 different ways. So it's a matter of which one is in the answer choices as far as which one am I going to pick. And that's using the quadratic formula. You don't always have to end up with something underneath the radical when you use the quadratic formula, but very often you do. Let me point out one more thing that can happen when you do quadratic formula. Let's do x squared plus 7x plus 12 equals 0. And I'm going to solve this with the quadratic formula. Find the zeros. So opposite of b is -7 plus or minus square root of 7 squared minus 4 times 1 times 12. Because 1 is my a and 12 is my c. All over 2 times 1. So this is -7 plus or minus the square root of 49 minus 48, all over 2, which is -7 plus or minus the square root of 1, all over 2. the two things I wanted to point out to you are, first of all, if you can bring it out from under the radical, you must do that. So this needs to keep going. -7 plus or minus 1, because the square root of 1 is 1. Secondly, you couldn't stop here because I know how to add -7 and 1, and I know how to add or subtract, really, -7 and 1. The reason we stopped here is because you can't add or subtract numbers that are under a radical with numbers that are not. But I can add or subtract numbers that are both regular old numbers. -7 plus 1, this is what this means. It means I have two options. -7 plus 1 all over 2 and -7 minus 1 all over 2. And these can both be simplified. -7 plus 1 is -6. Divide by 2 is -3, so there's an answer. -7 minus 1 is -8. Divide by 2 is -4, and there's my other answer. And that's pretty much all the possibilities you're going to have, all the different types of answers you would get with the quadratic formula. Voila!